Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into one of the most complex, most debated concepts in Islamic theology, Qadar. It's a topic that has tied scholars in knots for centuries, but what if the key to unlocking the whole thing has been hiding in plain sight all along? At the very heart of this whole conversation is a question I think we've all asked ourselves at some point. Is my fate already written? Are we just actors reading from a script that's already been finalized, or are we actually the ones writing our own stories? This single question is really our doorway into the whole world of Qadar. Okay, so for a lot of people, the confusion starts right here. Qadar, which usually gets translated as divine destiny, is widely taught as a fundamental pillar of faith. But when we go to the primary source, the Quran, the picture, well, it gets a lot more interesting. For example, if you look at key verses in the Quran, like in chapters 2 and 4, they clearly lay out the 5 core beliefs. You know the list: belief in God, his angels, his books, his messengers, and the last day. But take a close look. Notice what's missing. There is no mention of Qadr in these foundational lists of what you need to believe in. So you might be asking, where did this idea of 6 pillars come from then? Well, it mainly comes from a very famous narration, a hadith, called the Hadith of Jibril. But what's really fascinating is that even when you look at the different versions of that same story, some of them include belief in Qadr, and some don't, which just adds another layer to this whole puzzle. And that brings us to this number, 131. Even though it's not listed as a pillar of faith, the root word for Qadr shows up 131 times in the Quran. So what does that tell us? It tells us that this is an absolutely critical concept that we are meant to understand, and understand correctly. To really get to the bottom of the problem, we first have to understand how Qadr is traditionally defined. Because, as you're about to see, it's these definitions that create the very paradoxes we need to solve. Okay, so here's a pretty standard definition from the Diana Islamic Encyclopedia. The key words to focus on here are knowing and determining. This doesn't just mean God knows what's going to happen. It implies he actively determined it, which points to a completely fixed future. Let's look at another one. This definition really emphasizes God's will, preordaining every event in a specific way from the very beginning of time. Again, the feeling you get is that everything is already locked in. And this third common definition, well, it drives that point home even harder. It really paints a picture of a complete, unchangeable script for the entire universe, including every single thing you and I will ever do, written from eternity past to eternity future. And this is where things start to get really tricky, because when you take those traditional definitions and you put them side by side with other core Islamic beliefs, like God's justice and our own personal responsibility, some deeply unsettling questions start bubbling up to the surface. Let's start with this one. Think about it. If God has already decided absolutely everything, and we're all just actors playing out our predetermined roles, then what's the point of this whole universe? What is the point of the journey if the destination is already carved in stone? This leads to a huge question about justice. If a person's good actions and bad actions were already decreed by God from the very beginning, how could it possibly be just to then reward or punish them for it? The early scholar Hassan al-Basri had this great analogy. He said it would be like ordering a blind person to see and then punishing them for not being able to. And right here, we run into a direct theological contradiction. The Quran is crystal clear that God is not pleased with disbelief from his servants. So how can God, on one hand, will for an act of disbelief to happen, but on the other hand, be displeased by that very same act? The traditional view creates a conflict right inside the concept of God's will. And what does this do to the purpose of our lives? The Quran tells us we were created for a test, for a reason. But if our final destination in the afterlife is already decided before we're even born, doesn't this whole incredible, complex human experience just become sort of a meaningless game? Now, the common theological answer you'll hear for all these problems is this idea of a partial will. It's the idea that, sure, we have the free will to choose, but God's will is what's ultimate. But that doesn't really solve the paradox, does it? If our choice can never actually change the predetermined outcome, then what real power does it have? The end result is still fixed. So we're left with this concept that seems to contradict justice, purpose, and even other parts of the Quran. But what if the entire problem isn't the concept itself, What if the problem is just how we've translated one single crucial word? What if there's a clue hidden in its very letters? Okay, this is the turning point. These are the three Arabic root letters for the word kader: kaf, dal, and ra. Now, in Arabic, the core meaning of words comes from these three-letter roots. The answer to this entire paradox is hiding right here. And boom, here it is, the solution. When you actually analyze all 131 times this root appears in the Quran, you find its consistent primary meaning isn't unchangeable fate. It's to measure, to proportion, or to determine the measure of something. It's all about setting laws, parameters, and quantities. So let's just see what happens when we reframe the entire concept. Let's stop thinking about Qadr as fate and start understanding it as divine measure. This one little shift changes absolutely everything, and it resolves all of those unsettling questions we just asked. I mean, look at this. The difference is night and day. Unchangeable fates is always clashing with free will, but divine measure works in perfect harmony with it. Fate makes you question God's justice. Measure upholds it, because we're judged on how we act within the measures and laws God has set. This one change transforms Qadar from a mystical, confusing idea into something logical, almost scientific. And you know, the best part is, you don't have to take my word for it. You can actually verify this for yourself. Go to any online Quran analysis tool, search for those root letters, Qaf, Dal, Ra, and just read through the 131 verses where it appears. See for yourself if the meaning of measure or proportion doesn't fit the context way better than unchangeable fate. When you understand it this way, as divine measure, the whole concept of Qadr just snaps perfectly into place. It aligns with all the Quran's laws, all its stories about choice and consequence, and with the ultimate purpose of why we were created. Suddenly, it goes from being the most confusing concept in the Quran to one of the most logical and, honestly, one of the most empowering. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. If Qadr isn't a pre-written destiny we're chained to, but instead it's the set of universal laws and principles, the divine measure, within which we live and operate, what does that imply about our own power, our own responsibility, and our own freedom to act within that measure?